right. Hi, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, which is our start time, and this is a bigger panel, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started, just to make sure that we have time for everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 24th annual CLIF. Today's panel is Gender and Migration. Sorry, I guess I should introduce myself because there are new people here. My name is Julia Ariane Martins, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this year's CLIF conference. And I'm excited to introduce our final panel, Gender and Migration. So before we get started with the papers, I'd like to introduce our faculty respondent, Professor Peggy McCracken. Professor McCracken is jointly appointed in the departments of Comparative Literature, Romance Languages and Literatures, and Women and Gender Studies here at the University of Michigan. She researches and teaches the intersections of medieval literature, history, and theory. And her most recent book, In the Skin of a Beast, Sovereignty and Animality in Medieval France, explores the relations of dominion and mastery as represented through human-animal interactions. Thank you so much, Professor McCracken, for taking the time to participate in CLIF today. So our first panelist today is Rachel Stroup. She is presenting Ignorant of Our Standards, Rhetoric of Anti-Immigration in Louise de Koven Bowen's Safeguards for City Youth at Work and Play from 1914. Rachel Stroup is a PhD student in English, Literacy, Writing, and Rhetoric at the University of Maryland, College Park. She holds a master's in English with a focus on rhetoric and composition, and a graduate certificate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Ohio University. Her current research interests include theories and histories of rhetoric, progressive era history, historical women's rhetoric, writing centers, and writing program administration. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to mute myself and go.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's cool with everybody. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting on this conference. The title of my presentation today is Ignorant of Our Standards, Rhetorics of Anti-Immigration in Louise de Koven Bowen's Feminist and Urban Activism. I ended up changing the title a little bit, but I hope that makes for a more interesting presentation. Between 1900 and 1917, the American population rapidly increased as Eastern and Southern European immigrants from Poland, Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary flocked to the American cities to grasp a hold of industrial work opportunities. Cities such as New York and Chicago offered the promise of cultural and political freedom and a sense of independence that was waning in the Eastern and Southern European governments. But though the United States cloaked itself as a welcoming melting pot for European immigrants, this influx of immigration prompted a radical shift in the fabric of American culture, as life was now centered around the urban sphere and away from the domesticity of the home. The changes to the industrial city certainly did not escape native-born Americans, who slowly came to feel possessive over themselves, their families, and American culture, as they witnessed the diaspora of European populations take over their cities. Along with this fear about the disintegration of the Victorian home came the fear that standards of moral and sexual purity were becoming corrupted by Eastern and Southern European immigrants who, per Americans, were clueless of Western standards. Accordingly, a large body of moral panic literature arose from about 1900 to 1917 about the threat of sexual immorality and prostitution in the cities as a result of urbanization and the immigrant influence. Historian Mark Thomas Connolly writes that, quote, the impetus for the federal government's increased interest in the relationship between immigration and prostitution was the alleged existence of an international white slave traffic in which women and girls were moved from country to country for the purposes of prostitution, end quote. Fears over white slavery were rampant. White slavery referred to the trafficking of white girls into prostitution. When the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910 was passed, which criminalized the act of transporting women from state to state for prostitution, Many Americans became attuned to the corruption of the city streets, searching desperately to find the cause of moral disintegration and a solution to protect the purity of American-born girls. In this presentation, I explore the body of literature on white slavery and its commentary on immigrant girls. To home in on the intersections of feminist motives, immigration, and white slavery commentary, I focus on the writing from female moral reformer Louise Koven Bowen, a wealthy white American woman who made it her life's work to protect young girls from the corruptive influences of the city streets. Bowen's work illustrates that for many female reformers during the Progressive era, their activist work was rooted in the conviction that the moral foundation of the home was being threatened by the relocation of American life to the cities, and that immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were instrumental for perpetuating this corruption. This presentation will show that when we look back on activist movements of the early 20th century, such as suffrage movements and anti-white slavery movements, we must look expansively at the extent of the values held by activists who led the way, and that by exploring their commentary on immigration, we can see that their motives may be more preservationist than we tend to believe. Bowen was a well-known social reformer based in Chicago. She worked alongside her good friend Jane Addams in the formation of Hull House, which was a settlement house for new immigrants. Bowen's work as president of the Juvenile Protection Association led her to pursue legislation that regulated urban recreation and implemented chaperonage for girls on the city streets. Throughout her life, she served as treasurer and traveled about the country with Jane Addams and the National Women's Suffrage Association and was active in many ladies' clubs. Her body of work includes titles such as Safeguard for City Youth at Work and Play, The Road to Destruction Made Easy in Chicago, and The Straight Girl on the Crooked Path, as well as many other texts that fervently discuss the threat of the city streets to the morality of young people. Working within each of these texts, though, is a keen observance to how immigration was uprooting the character of the old Chicago that Bowen grew up in the late 19th century. Bowen was raised in wealth and married into privilege, and her involvement in social organizations in Chicago, as well as her extensive writing, conveys her values and the values of her elite acquaintances. To social reformers of the day, America seemed like the coveted place to start a new life, and Bowen acknowledged this fact while also noting that the immigrant came to America fully ignorant of how to live according to American moral standards. For example, in Safeguards for the City Youth, she paints a picture of the typical immigrant. She says, quote, "As immigrants land at Ellis Island, their faces are full of eagerness and expectation. The hardships of the long voyage are forgotten. The discomforts are ignored. America has stood to them as an ideal country, an asylum for the oppressed, where they might enjoy religious liberty and freedom from persecution," end quote. And yet, in Bowen's estimation, the process of Americanization becomes troubled when the Eastern or Southern European immigrant girl falls prey to the white slave traders waiting at the borders. According to Bowen, these girls, quote, "are ignorant of our standards and are easily persuaded that judgment for a moral lapse is less severe in America than it is in the old country. Too late they find themselves disgraced and are forced to enter a disreputable life in order to support themselves," end quote. In Bowen's concern for the immigrant girl, two key trends emerge. One, her interest in sheltering the girl from her arrival at Ellis Island as she traveled to the American cities. And two, Bowen's fear of the absence of home life for the immigrant girl, since the home was perceived to be the moral foundation for American women. Particularly for activists like Bowen, their interventionist style harnesses a domestic influence, since her work aimed to provide structured moral influence in tenement houses. On the one hand, we can see this interventionist activism as an extension of Americanization by imposing structural means to assimilate immigrants into American culture. But on the other hand, these activist moves were predicated on the conviction that the immigrant was too ignorant to be a contributive American citizen and needed the intervention of wealthy Americans. This certainly rings true in Bowen's fear of white slavery in Chicago. For example, in Safeguards, Bowen proposes that the solution to reducing white slave traffic in Chicago is to implement federal chaperonage for girls who arrive at Ellis Island. She states, quote, "We need in Chicago some sort of federal regulation which shall provide for the large number of immigrant girls who come to this country and for whom government responsibility ceases when they leave Ellis Island." They should be put on the railroad train under the care of some official, instead of being left, as at present, to the mercy of any white slave trader who may board the train." End quote. Especially when it came to the popular issue of women's suffrage, the immigrant girls' perceived ignorance factored into Bowen's call for women's right to vote. For example, in Bowen's suffragist speeches, much of her commentary on the prospect of immigrant women voting asserts that the immigrant voter is ignorant. In a speech at the Republican convention in Springfield in 1912, she states, quote, "It is urged that extending the vote to women would only double the ignorant vote, and that we have too many ignorant foreigners and illiterates voting now." The reply to this is a mere matter of computation upon figures easily secured from the United States Census report, that there are approximately an equal number of American men and American women in this country, but that there are more than twice as many immigrant men as immigrant women. An extension of this franchise to all the adult women in the nation, therefore, would result in doubling the American vote. To those who believe that more wisdom resides in the native-born American than in any immigrant, however gifted, this should be a great comfort and incidentally an incentive to work for women's suffrage." End quote. Her logic here is that if immigrant women are also granted the right to vote, the fact that the number of American women is greater would cancel out the ignorant vote of the immigrant woman. So this theme of immigrant ignorance reflects a larger anxiety about the changing state of the American population. The problem was that as immigrants' influence in the industrial sphere took center stage, the disintegration of the American family home as the bedrock of American culture was slowly fading into the past. It is important to note that American social reformers tended to distinguish Northwestern Europeans from Eastern and Southern European immigrants in their moral character. For example, popular activists against white slavery, E. Noreen Law, wrote in 1909 that the more preferable immigrants came from Northwestern Europe. She wrote, "Drawn first from the higher and more intelligent types of Northwestern Europe, our immigration has degenerated constantly into the poorest breeds of Eastern and Southern sections of the continent." End quote. Likewise, Bowen also identified that the Eastern and Southern European immigrant home was not imbued with the moral structure that the young girl needed, which made her vulnerable to white slave traffic. The Polish, for example, were the largest population of Eastern European immigrants in Chicago, and reformers like Bowen often warned that the Polish were the most ignorant and most vulnerable to potential corruption. Bowen writes in Safeguards, for example, quote, "Very often Polish girls are found in large cities living together. Perhaps one of the girls has a brother, and he brings other men to board. There is no older woman to warn them of the danger. They forget the things that have been so carefully taught by their mothers. They lose, in their confined quarters, their sense of what is decent and proper, and soon become demoralized." End quote. The panic over the downfall of the wayward immigrant girl was, I argue, symptomatic of the decentralization of the Victorian home in the United States. Bowen herself was fixated on the ideal of the home. She writes in one of her memoirs that her and her juvenile protection committees always, quote, "took great interest in the home." And when she gave any speech at a suffragist convention, she said, "My subject was always the woman in the home." In discussing her activist work, Bowen says that her chief endeavor has always been to keep the home intact and to preserve the family circle. From this, we can deduce that when Bowen said immigrants are ignorant of our standards, part of what she meant was that immigrants did not believe as strongly in the moral foundation of the domestic home that had existed for American girls throughout the 19th century. The characteristics of the 20th century moral reform, led by those like Bowen, took on more industrial concerns, as these activists struggled to cope with the absence of a domestic bedrock for young women, which heightened their panic over prostitution. Historians have agreed that the panic over white slavery in the early 20th century was mostly manufactured, as there is little empirical evidence to suggest that hordes of young women were being brought in from Europe and trafficked all over the country. Nonetheless, this white slavery panic reflects larger anxieties that emerged during the Progressive era. Moral panics over women's safety were nothing new to the United States during the Progressive era, as evidenced by the temperance movement of the 19th century, for example. But the immigration circumstances of the progressive era gave new life to older anxieties and provided activists new reasons to explore the perceived causes of moral decline. Much of the fear over the white slave traffic of young immigrant girls concerned Eastern and Southern European immigrant girls because of the perceived degeneracy of their cultures. Mark Thomas Connolly writes that, quote, in earlier periods of the Republic's history, immigrants had come mainly from Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. During the Progressive era, however, most immigrants, in some years 80%, came from Italy, Austria-Hungary, Poland, or Russia. Not surprisingly, the new immigration became a major national issue during the Progressive years, which is present in the anti-white slavery literature. This groundbreaking shift in the demographics of the American cities, no doubt, held a heavy influence on the activists' diagnosis of social problems, which of course came with the misguided perceptions about the nature of immigrant communities and immigrant girls' sexual morality. Even though progressive activists like Bowen and her contemporaries made important headway in granting the women right to vote by providing shelter for new immigrants, these progressive movements also clung to a nativist perspective of the United States and hinged on the conviction that the ideal of the American home was becoming incompatible with the immigrant influence on American cities. By looking at prominent activist figures like Bowen, who exhibited empathy for the subjects of her reform, but ultimately believed in the ignorance of those she tried to help, we can see that progressive activism harnessed both good-natured and selfish motives, anchored by an American nationalist appeal aimed to preserve a domestic moral foundation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was perfect timing, Rachel. I just wanted, before I introduce our next panelist, I just wanted to give the panelists a heads up that when you guys have about 2 minutes left, I'm going to send you a private message over the Zoom chat, just saying 2 minutes. All right, so our next panelist is Judith Popova, who will be presenting the female stranger's experience of mobility in the post-war climate. Judith is a PhD researcher in English literature at the University of Surrey and teaches both creative writing and English literature classes. Her doctoral thesis focuses on the blurring borders of citizenship and transnationalism in Muriel Sparks' fiction, particularly the representations of her exilic characters and their displaced settings, post-national utopias, and the use of telecommunications as gendered constructs. She completed her MA in English literature at the University of Surrey in 2017 and holds a BA in liberal arts from King's College London, and was also a part of a semester exchange program at the University of Michigan back in 2015. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you, Julia, for that lovely introduction. Thank you for having me today at the conference. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just one moment. Okay, so I'll be discussing the female stranger's experience of mobility in the post-war climate, taking a look at one of Muriel Sparks' very early novels called Robinson. So first, before I do that, I want to introduce us to what is the stranger and the concept. So it was originally started by Robert Ezra Park and Everett Stonequest's concept of the marginal man in 1926, suggesting that the marginal man is one that sits outside of society's borders and doesn't quite belong anywhere. Then, according to Alfred Schutz in 1944, the stranger is a potential wanderer. In most cases, he is an immigrant. Zuma Ullman in 1996 defined him as he is a stranger uprooted from each place and not at home in any. And as we can see in all of these 20th century definitions, the stranger is always identified as a masculine concept. Janet Wolfe in 1995 actually challenges this notion in her study Resident Alien, arguing that we need to reconsider this neglected figure of the female stranger. So the female stranger is a little bit different to the traditional male stranger in literature. So we're going to take a look at what the differences are there. Wolfe argues the female stranger is not an anomaly in the fiction, rather she is a neglected character that takes the passenger seat in literary studies. So what makes the female stranger's experience so different to the male strangers? Unlike the male stranger, otherwise termed the flaneur, Women, however, cannot go into unfamiliar spaces without drawing attention to themselves, or without mobilizing those apparently necessary strategies of characterization through which they can be neutralized and rendered harmless, end of quote. Meaning it is impossible for women to enjoy the same anonymity as men because they become a gazed object. So when we're thinking of applying this concept to the female stranger in Muriel Sparks Robinson, we understand that January, who is the protagonist, is immediately immobilized geographically and culturally in Robinson. The novel opens with January already stranded on a desert island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. The island is called Robinson itself, obviously fictionalized. So firstly, January is geographically immobilized by the same instrument that first grants her transnational mobility. She takes a commercial aircraft, which is symbolic of the golden age of air travel in the 1950s. As C.N. Evans states, beginning of the quote, long distance commercial air travel by air was revolutionary in the 1950s, and by the early 1960s, 95% of passenger traffic across the Atlantic was by aircraft, end quote. So the second stage of the pattern that we see that January falls into as the female stranger is that she becomes subject to stereotypical gender roles prescribed by men on and off the island setting, which is something we will discuss. Thirdly, January must cautiously navigate and adopt necessary strategies along her foreign travels, such as befriending men as temporary travel companions as a way to anonymize herself to others and avoid becoming a victim to violence against women. All the while, the narrative satirizes the social cultural climate of Britain by creating a remote island dictated by men to mirror the gendered attitudes of the 1950s. So here we have a quotation from one of the male characters in the text called Jimmy. So he immediately imposes a gendered stereotype on January's character, and we have the conversation that occurs. You like this, said Jimmy. He says this to January's character, and then this proceeds immediately after. He held out to me a little shining lipstick case. I took it and opened it. The lipstick inside was almost unused, but not quite. There was a little blunt smear at the end. Suddenly I threw it with a clink. It was salvage, I said. I was not only repelled by the idea of using a dead woman's lipstick, I was furious at Jimmy's implication that I must entertain a romantic interest in Robinson. I felt that Robinson had repeated my complaint. I darkly disconcerted they had been discussing me considerably as a female problem. So this exchange between January and Jimmy symbolizes the problematic perception of women's actions and appearance being tied to their gender roles as companions to men, as opposed to characteristics exclusive to their identity. January is immediately offended by the implications of being offered lipstick by Jimmy. First, it infers that as a woman, her concern for her physical aesthetic outweighs her survivalist instinct, contradictory to the man's priority. Second, it implies that Jimmy believes her to have some romantic or sexual interest and role that she wishes to pursue simply because she has expressed a concern for her physical appearance on the island. Consequently, for this reason, both Jimmy and Robinson see her as a gendered problem amongst them, as they do not share the same aesthetic concerns and misread the intentions behind January's complaint. The men's approach to January as a female problem delimits the feminine experience as a gross misrepresentation to mean problems typically associated with gendered topics such as courtship and marriage. January's intentions are sexualized through the masculine gaze, despite no indication that she has a romantic interest or intention with any of the male characters in the novel. These assumptions single January out amongst the castaways on the island, based solely on gender. Here we begin to see how the island locale, although geographically and architecturally different to the typically male constructed city, the island fails to free itself from the ideological impositions, particularly gendered ones, its inhabitants place on it. In fact, the men prescribe January a gendered role on the island, the same one they believe she would have in Britain, and that is one of a very primitive nature for her to be a female companion to a man on the island. So next we have Tom Wells, another male character on the island with January, who imposes another gendered stereotype onto her character. He says, "Look here, I don't think a woman should have charge of the guns. I don't agree to that." Tom Wells' misogynistic view also explores preconceived notions attributed to gender roles within the island setting, when he disagrees with January's possession of the key for the weapons storage. Tom's judgment towards women is not shaped by January's presence or their newfound setting, but is merely symbolic of the ingrained attitudes he has harbored from his British origins and applies to this third setting through his projection on her as a woman. As Virginia Nicholson argues, in 1950s, start of quote, Britain remained a world of stereotypes and impossible ideals where deviancy was met with ignorance and hostility. With Nicholson's point in mind, it is clear why Wells exhibits unprovoked ignorance and hostility towards January, as he believes as a woman she should not have the position of power that may endanger a man, deeming her deviant by his deep-seated societal standards. Tom's fear of January's deviance is exhibited by his overt surveillance of her actions, stating, "I can see you," after January had already noticed him watching me on several occasions. Spark illuminates how Wells attempts to reinstate control over January as a woman by making her subservient and helpless, by disagreeing with her position of authority, further symbolic of the gender dynamic dominant in Britain at the time. Once again, January is prescribed a gender role that means to strip her of control, to make her an inferior subject to the will of men. These static gender roles prescribed to January by the men of the island highlight the instilled social cultural values that British men attributed to women in the 1950s. Summers Burner argues, start quote, Robinson and Brodie's interest in female danger can be seen as displacement of a more pressing fear that the novel does not overtly elaborate on, end quote. The more pressing fear Summer Barman could be alluding to is the fear of women becoming more socially empowered and as a result, threatening the existing patriarchy of power. In effect, the male castaways subconsciously carry their preconceived notions of gender with them to the island setting and reaffirm them in the way they are perceived and treat January's character. So here we have Ian Brodie, who is the brother-in-law of January, and he perceives January in this gendered stereotype off of the island setting, also in a flashback scene that we are introduced to. So Ian Brodie had been loud against me leaving home for so long a period. Ian Brodie's suspicion was that I had a lover whom I supposed to meet abroad, in time returning prim and replenished to my chaste widowhood for the summer holidays. Much like how Tom Wells felt personally offended by January's control over the weapons locker on the island, we see how Ian Brodie is troubled by January's mobility abroad, highlighting the parallel attitudes January experiences on and off the island setting. Ian implies there is a promiscuous nature to January's travels and attempts to coerce his control over her by intending to shame her into submission. In each of these instances, we understand how a woman's control upsets what men perceive as a natural hierarchy of power, and so the men of the novel become vocal of their aversion to it. January's travels abroad place her in the masculine public sphere, a place women have not been considered to belong to. For this reason, Ian presumes January's activities must be of a sexualized nature since she is operating in a man's domain. As Estelle McDowell and Alfred Dyer argue, women are long seen as objects of consumerist society, in the position of prostitute and being the object of the male gaze and desire, end quote, and throughout literature of the 19th century. It is evident that Spark exposes how little attitudes towards mobile women had remained unchanged throughout the 1950s through the characterization of Ian Brodie. Ian's suspicions suggest January soliciting sex and inevitably the subject of the male gaze wherever she may go. Ian's protests intend to manipulate January's actions to best adhere to his own opinions regarding what he deems acceptable for a woman's behavior. Spark's exposure of these misogynistic views criticizes the restrictive social attitudes women were still being subject to in the middle of the 20th century. Ian insinuates that January must have a lover along her travels, suggesting her mobility as a woman must be tied up with her promiscuous actions. Ian's speculation over the reason for January's mobility are unfounded. However, Ian's distrustful behavior exposes how the male gaze is needlessly intrusive and finds a way to haunt and as a result immobilize the lone female stranger on the island. So, how does January deal with her gendered role as a mobile woman? She adopts a strategy to best navigate her settings. So January states, I find that when traveling abroad alone, it is wise and actually discreet to take up with one well-chosen man to travel on the journey. Otherwise, one is likely to be approached by numerous chance pesterers all along the line. One must, of course, discriminate, but it is a thing one learns from experience. How to know the sort of man who is not likely to press for future commitments, end of quote. So January's deduction sets the tone for how the female stranger is prescribed and conforms to predisposed gender roles in this novel. The narrator's solution to this gender problem between men and women suggests that women should seek out a temporary male companion, as it allows them to appear preoccupied in the company of one male's attention, and so in turn will be left alone from the dangerous gaze of another man. Jill Valentine characterizes this as an example of the coping strategy that women adopt to stay safe. Valentine details, beginning of the quote, this inability of women to enjoy independence and freedom to move safely in public spaces is therefore one of the pressures which encourages them to seek one man's protection from all, end quote. January's method of protection coincides with Valentine's coping strategy, as she proactively seeks a companion in order to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation with other men along their travels. The passage infers that the attention a woman receives along her travels would likely be of a sexual nature, as implied by press for future commitments, suggesting that women are quickly objectified as possessions and only safe if they are already under another male's gaze. As Elaine Showalter argues, women are represented as a group so conditioned to the victim role and so far from attempting any kind of violence, even in self-defense, that their expanded awareness of sex crimes only increases their sense of helplessness, vulnerability, and fear in representations of literature. Similarly, sociologists argue most women drastically alter their behavior and patterns of movement as a consequence of fear of male violence. Applying this to Sparks' depiction of January, we understand her fear of becoming a victim at the hands of a man is explored for her need to create a self-defense mechanism that preemptively manages her actions and protects herself from the vulnerabilities a woman experiences. Ultimately, January's strategy is a characterization of fear women harbor amongst becoming a victim of male violence. Subsequently, this fear imposes conditions on January's mobility in a way men's mobility is not affected, meaning she is unable to freely navigate her setting without accounting for her presence amongst men. Okay, and then I just wanted to briefly say, the island is a masculine space. So January is already predisposed to this setting that she is outside of the borders of where she would generally be accepted. So the hostile and confining masculine setting of the island can be read as a metaphor for January's experience of mobility as a woman more generally, limited, monitored, and variably subject to the masculine gaze. So by reframing January as a female stranger through a gender mobilities paradigm, I have argued her seat amongst the female Robin Zaids of the canon. While glimpses of January's mobility exist in the novel, Robinson reflects on the hindrances of the masculine gaze on women's agency in male-dominated spaces. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that great paper. Next, we have Tommy Drucker, who will be presenting A Horror with a Camera, the marking and the erasure of the body of the Femina Sakra and Sharon Yaish and Yael Shahar's documentary, A Horror Like Me. Tommy is now entering her second year of the PhD at the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan. She finished her BA and MA at the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, and her research interests focus on questions of gender and embodiment and the ancient myths of the Judeo-Christian tradition and their reception in contemporary literature. Take it away. I think you're muted.
That's right. Well, I just said thank you and that it's great to be here. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, so I'm going to speak about A Horror with a Camera and through a close reading of the film A Horror Like Me by Sharon Yaish and Yael Shachar. It's an Israeli documentary film. So the film tells the story of Sheila, who was kidnapped from Hungary when she was 22 years old and trafficked to Israel for prostitution. Today, 20 years later, after she has managed to escape from to go through rehabilitation, Sheila is asking for a residency certificate that will allow her to stay in Israel and work. But the Israeli Ministry of Interior decides that she must be deported based on lack of evidence of her story. The film the film follows Sheila in her attempt to obtain proof of her past as she hires a private investigator to assist her. Sheila is required to trace and remark the erased narrative that was inscribed upon her body. The Hungarian lullaby in the opening of the film connects Sheila as a baby in Hungary with the shower in Israel, where she meticulously scrubs her face. She thoroughly rubs every inch of her face and body as if she wants to clean and efface everything that has besmirched them. Yet she scrubs so hard that it seems almost as if the act of cleaning becomes at the same time the act of engraving, as if at the same time she wishes to erase the mark and etch them deeper to make them seen. The shower becomes the space in which her paradox is revealed. Her body cannot be cleaned of the marks because, as the state of Israel claimed, they are always already erased. This tension between marking and erasure becomes Sheila's journey, for in order to be allowed to stay and work within the borders of Israel, to be able to leave the cycle of prostitution, that is, to clean these marks of abjection from her body, Sheila is forced to present them. Israel is an immigration country that easily and exclusively accepts Jews as citizens, but its policy is very strict regarding non-Jewish people. The Hungarian song clashes with Sheila's fantastic mastering of the Hebrew language. Almost paradoxically, while the Hungarian lullaby contrasts the image of the whore, it also marks her as a foreigner who is excluded from the state as bare life or homo saucer in Giorgio Agamben's terms. But the Hungarian lullaby connects the baby with the prostitute in yet another way. The song that addresses a girl and describes her beauty and her body in a comparative manner lulls the baby girl woman into the reality in which her body is objectified, into a phallocentric global language that exceeds and thus overarches Hebrew and Hungarian. The language that expresses what Ariela Azoulay would call the infrastructure of rape, which is constituted by the abandonment of women by the law and their exclusion from the civil order. Sheila was abducted before Israel has even legislated a law against human trafficking. She says, "We thought, okay, we didn't manage to escape in Hungary, we will escape in Israel. But even the police would come in, they knew what we were doing and they did nothing. So where could we escape to?" Sheila's bare life was stripped from all civil rights as a femina sacra in Ronit Lentin's terms. She who cannot be killed but also impregnant, yet who cannot be sacrificed due to her impurity. The Hungarian lullaby reveals how the shower for Sheila is no longer only a private or intimate space, but a political one. The borders of the State of Israel are marked upon her erased body. The Ministry of Interior is sending Sheila to find evidence for what the state itself seeks to leave erased, abandoned, hidden. Early in the film, we learn that Sheila is studying photography. Azoulay conceptualized the civil contract of photography as a space that exceeds the power of the sovereign, that is not subject to nationality but rather to borderless citizenship. Through photography, Sheila re-enters the civil order and at the same time, by marking herself as erased, threatens to reveal the instability of its borders. When Sheila returns to prostitution in the course of the film, she's taking a camera with her. She says, "I take pictures every day. This time I'm leaving traces." The trace, according to Jacques Derrida, is the mark of the absence of a presence, an always already absent present. The trace is always already written under erasure. It effaces itself and thus provides itself with meaning as an erased being. The trace, as Sheila herself realizes, is her only way of bringing her body back into the symbolic order that has abjected her. Sheila's photos are traces of her lived experience of the prostitution, of the infrastructure of rape, and of the photographic act itself. This photo, which is once again located in the shower, is a trace of the significant turning point of her narrative, in which she becomes a prostitute with a camera. The whore, an erased subject, turns herself into the image that society seeks to repress for the chance of belonging to that society. Because she photographs herself photographing, the object that she turns herself into is that of a subject holding a camera. This photo, thus, challenges the boundaries of the subject-object binary drawn by the camera. Her autophotography exceeds not only the power of the state, but also the agreement of the subject-object binary upon which the civil contract of photography is structured. Azoulay claims that the rape is the only catastrophe that remains unrepresented in photography. This absence is the way in which rape is kept hidden, erased, and thus victims of rape are being abandoned. This taboo on images of rape, images that are immediately being categorized as pornographic and forbidden, is what allows the abandonment of women. I suggest that this important observation of Azoulay shows that women are abandoned not only by the state, but also by the civil contract of photography that Azoulay herself has conceptualized. The camera still functions as a border that demarcates a clear distinction between a subject and an object. Thus, while it allows certain freedom from the sovereign's power, it is still structured upon his rules. Sheila's photography does both things at once. It photographs the infrastructure of rape and destabilizes the subject-object binary. In fact, this is what the film does all along through the camera of the women filmmakers as well. Particularly in a scene towards the end, the women filmmakers ask Sheila if she remembers the name of the women who were kidnapped with her. Sheila mentions the names that she remembers, and the filmmakers' tears are heard from behind the camera. They say, "We're crying with you. Once you said their names, it became so real." Sheila cries as well, then smiles and says, "This is what we're here for." Their tears crack open the subject-object binary that the camera demarcates. The borders between behind and in front of it are crossed, and they all become just women aching the abandonment of women. This kind of moment breaks the taboo of photographing rape and breaks the object-subject agreement of photography. Doing both at once might be the only way for women to make a place for themselves within the civil contract of photography. This moment destabilizes the boundaries of the symbolic order itself, for it is the moment in which whores are being named. The whore and the proper name might mark the two poles of the symbolic order between which it stretches. The symbolic order, according to Lacan, is constituted by the name of the father and his law, the taboo of incest, and the desire towards the absent and forbidden body of the mother, thus of the female body as such. It is upon her denied body that language is structured. It is the traces of this body that Sheila seeks to turn into image through her photography. The name of the father enables the exchanging of nameless female bodies between men's families. While the proper name of the father is the signifier of signifiers, the whore signifies the erasure of the female body. It is the signification of the insignification, the mark of the unmarked. The moment in which Sheila mentions the names of the kidnapped women is the moment in which the whore and the proper name, the two opposed borders, merge in a way that cracks open the subject-object binary and the symbolic order. It is upon this moment that Sheila says, "This is what we're here for." In the scene that follows, the private investigator arrives at Sheila's apartment and shows her letters that he found written in her kidnapper's handwriting. Her name appears there and provides conclusive evidence to her story. She is written, marked, signified, brought back into the symbolic through the crack that she herself has created in it. Sheila is moved and struck by these letters. One of them, the private investigator explains, discusses the prices paid for the kidnapped women. He reads, Andrea said that there are 3 girls, but they want $800 for each. He then gently asks Sheila, do you know how much they paid for you? And she answers, overwhelmed, yes, they paid $10,000 for me. Yes, he asks. She thinks again and corrects herself, sorry, $1,000. Her mistake reveals once again the instability of the borders of the symbolic. It exposes the absurdity of the Derridian difference between the signifiers as an expression of the exchange value that is traced upon her body. It exposes the insignificance of the deferred difference between $1,000 and $10,000 as signifiers that allow her body to be exchanged. A whore like me is an invitation to see through the always already unstable boundaries of the symbolic, of the state, of photography, of the body, of the concept of the boundary itself. The title of the film is quoted from one of Sheila's monologues, in which she tells of a client who tried to cross the boundaries of her body that she herself has set. Look at me, I'm not an object, she told him. The guy left and came back after 3 hours and said, your words stayed with me. The moment you said that you're not an object, you shattered all of my denials. You're so intelligent. I didn't think. He swallowed his words, and Sheila tells of how she completed the sentence. You didn't think that there are whores like me. The recapture of her words as the title of the film deconstructs the whore as the other and cracks open the boundaries between the self and the other upon which the phallocentric order constitutes its denials. In order to be a part of the civil order, Sheila marks its boundaries and erases them at the same time. The film won the Israeli Oscar, the most prestigious recognition that a film can get within the borders of the State of Israel. By the time of the award ceremony, Sheila was still struggling to get her certificate of residency. That's it.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tony. Our next speaker is Amanda Nadeau, and she will be presenting Female Agency in La Pirogue. Amanda is a doctoral candidate in Romance Languages and Literatures here at the University of Michigan. She works on borders and migration between sub-Saharan Africa and Spain, and her research is presently focusing on mothering and gendered violence as it affects African women migrants to Spain. And I'll mute myself. Go ahead, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So yes, Female Agency in La Pirogue. Senegalese women's agency is severely limited in their migration to Spain based on route, race, and gender. An understudied category in migration, gender significantly impacts every aspect of the migratory experience. In this paper, I critically examine why and in what ways gender affects Senegalese women's irregular migration. Understanding the occurrences in the liminal and invisible space of the crossing uncovers the sexualized violence Senegalese and sub-Saharan African women endure to reach Europe. Male-dominated routes and borders coupled with media attention on male migrants make female migrants largely invisible and vulnerable. Moussa Touré's 2012 film La Pirogue uniquely and subtly showcases the gendered experience in the sea journey to Spain of one female Senegalese stowaway among an otherwise all-male migrant group. Out of the set of gendered structures that exist in Senegalese migration culture and the Senegalese Spanish border crossing experience, she manages to find power and agency. Through a close reading of the film, as one example from a small corpus, I assert that cinematic representations of Senegalese migrant women demonstrate that gender impacts their crossing through violence, vulnerability, and agency. Following recent scholars, I find the migrant agent-victim dichotomy unproductive and demonstrate how in the crossing, amidst limitations, female migrants create space for agency. This research contributes to the understudied experience of sub-Saharan African women migrants en route to Spain and Europe, and the role gender plays in the migration. While here I focused on Senegalese women to Spain, this work can likely be used to evaluate a greater demographic of sub-Saharan African women to Europe. Migrant women's varying degrees of agency depend on gender, route, and travel companions, such as children or a spouse. A securitized border in the way of built structure, border guards, and smugglers, and the Senegalese migration culture and gender norms limit women's agency before and during their migration. In regards to route, air travel is the safest, and land travel is the most dangerous for women. Due to a male-controlled border and mediatic hypervisibilization of Black male migrants, female migrants are largely invisible and vulnerable. Without minimizing the violence they endure, it is important to move beyond treating women as only victims and recognize simultaneous moments of vulnerability and agency, which capture the gender differences in the migratory crossing from Senegal to Spain. Sarah Mahler and Patricia Pessar developed a system to evaluate gender in migration with their 2001 article, Gender Geographies of Power, Analyzing Gender Across Transnational Spaces. They assess gender and agency in a transnational context through their Gender Geographies of Power framework, adding a migrant's social location and geographic scales to Doreen Massey's power geometry. Social location helps us understand one's agency is not based solely on their individual decision-making, but is dependent on a variety of factors into which they were born, both structural and ideological. Geographic scales refer to the physical location that is covering a transnational space as well as the site of the human body. In particular to African women, a number of case studies on sub-Saharan African migrant women and mothers in the Moroccan waiting areas were published as early as 2012 by a number of scholars. But to my knowledge, there has been no work published on gender and women's experience in Senegalese or sub-Saharan African sea migration. Black African women migrants' invisibility in real life through little mediatic and governmental attention is perpetuated in the literary and filmic worlds. Spanish cinema has largely ignored Black African women migrants. Only 2 feature films have included them as protagonists, the 14 Kilómetros in 2007 and Beautiful in 2010, even though a much greater number of films have centered on the plight of Senegalese or Black male migrants over the past 30 years with films such as Las Cartas de Alu from 1990, Buana from 96, Poniente 2002, just to name a few. Documentaries have done marginally better, including African women characters, but not protagonists. Given the smaller number of Senegalese produced films, Senegalese cinema and literature has comparatively made greater efforts to visibilize the female migrant to Europe, starting in 1966 rather, with Ousmane Sembène's film La Noire de. In terms of literature, Fatou Diome and Ken Bogol have consistently provided stories on African female immigrants to France. French-Senegalese author Marine Ndiaye and filmmaker Diana Gay present new destinations for Senegalese women migrants, Spain and Italy. And Moussa Touré's film La Pirogue offers the one filmic close-up of the gendered experience for Senegalese sea migrants to Spain. Well-known Senegalese filmmaker Moussa Touré's 2012 film, La Pirogue, is a journey film that takes place almost entirely at sea, on a fishing boat. It debuted at Cannes in the category Un Certain Regard as the only film produced in sub-Saharan Africa. Considered a mock documentary, this film displays a group of Senegalese and Ghanaian migrants of diverse ethnicities as they embark on a journey from Dakar to the Canary Islands. It highlights the emotional trauma sea migrants experience, from the anxiety-provoking confinement to a small space, and tough decisions like that of not saving passengers of another boat to witnessing death. The film is based on Abbas Jones' 2008 novel Bekemi, meaning sea migration. Following Joan, Touré's choice to include a woman in the boat to Spain gives her a literal seat at the proverbial table, and viewers a chance to visualize and contemplate the different gendered experiences. The sole woman migrant of the 31 passengers is Nafi, of whom we learn after being discovered as a stowaway. Her motive for emigrating is to financially support her 2 children after the death of her husband, who died in an attempted boat crossing. While the focus on male-only emigration preparations, the audience pays little attention to Nafi, and thus her appearance on the boat is a surprise for both audience and passengers. La Pirogue proves that men facilitate entry to Spain, but cannot remain there, and thus block women's attempts to remain as well because they enter and stay together. The cast of 6 to 7 characters of the original 31 who arrived to the Canary Islands are repatriated 2 weeks later. Without the male characters, the journey, that is the departure from Senegal, would not have occurred, as the occasion of the trip is facilitated by male funders, organizers, and captains. As such, this film explores stereotypically masculine qualities, such as strength and courage, and who can hold them, and who has access to power and agency. Touré uses space and shot selection to question the gender dichotomies that exist in Senegalese migration and culture. Nafi finds herself in difficult situations based on gender. Her condition as a stowaway validates these consequences for the passengers and audience, as well as conceals or obscures the fact that the treatment is gender-based. Out of the set of gendered structures that exists, Nafi manages to find power and agency. Space plays a significant role in proposing and questioning gendered roles throughout the film, even prior to the migration. The opening scene of a Senegalese wrestling match known as Buddy is the epitome of masculinity and the location in which we meet the film's male protagonists. While women attend the match, cheering on the wrestlers from the grandstand, the protagonists watch courtside. We first see Nafi in her occupation as a water well attendant, a space for women. Prior to the trip, people exist in their respective masculine and feminine spaces, and later, Nafi invades a male-only space of the boat. Migration is a male act in Senegalese culture, and the masculine space of the boat supports this. In its use as a fishing boat, fishermen go out to sea for a month at a time. As a means of migratory transportation, the boat remains masculine. Men leave to financially provide when they cannot do so at home. In another sign of masculinity, Gore fit, which is Wolof for men must be courageous, is the adage painted on the fishing boat, and the camera continually reminds the audience of this through wide shots, half circles, and close-ups of the boat, especially the words. A woman entering a masculine space equals having to deal with gendered expectations and being blamed for bad luck on the voyage. As a stowaway, Nafi is accused of having an accomplice to aid in her access to the boat. In order to confine her to feminine space and roles, Lasana, the organizer of the trip, demands she cook for the passengers during the trip. Conveniently disguised as punishment for sneaking onto the boat, this would have likely been her fate regardless, as the sole woman passenger. Shot selection creates the effect of being marginalized, even in the small space of a boat. Nafi often appears at the edge of the shot. In a medium shot, Nafi appears bent over a pot of food to serve herself after having served the men. She is alone in her section of the boat, while men gathered eating on either side of this otherwise empty section. She sits down alone and begins eating from her own plate when Lasana invades her private space by sitting down next to her to flirt and touch her arm. On another occasion, she does not get a vote in the decision to use the engine's gas, as evidenced by her location behind the men, hardly in the shot at all, only her legs and torso visible, while the captain, Bai Lai, who is to the left, directs his attention to the small group of men in the shot and the larger group just beyond them that is seen in a subsequent shot. That she is first introduced in the film through a shot from behind her head and first on the boat covered in a blanket and hood contribute to her invisibility and marginalization and will be played out in her treatment as an other during the voyage. Nafi is subject to power laws of Senegalese sea migration. While the violent desert landscape often necessitates a travel husband for land migrants, Nafi's resistance strategies include a mix of herself and a few male passengers. At sea, migrants are just as invisible to the world as desert travelers, but in the confined space of the boat, they are hypervisible to one another. This hypervisibility creates a less violent, both sexual and otherwise, space for Nafi, since it could only happen if no man was willing to stand up to it. In the moments in which she is threatened, a few different men step in, her friend Kaba being the first. Nafi appreciates Kaba's protection but does not compensate it with sex or romance. On the boat, there would be no place for physical intimacy anyways. Having confessed his love for her, Kaba asks her to come with him in Europe, but she states she has a job waiting for her in Paris so as to support her children. Other migrants, like Captain Bai Lai, also save Nafi from violence for humanitarian, that is, not romantic reasons. At the outset of the journey, when Nafi reveals herself aboard, Lasana makes a scene arguing to throw her overboard. What about the rations, one asks. Kaba offers to share his food with her. Bai Lai further settles the dispute by mediating that Nafi will pay Lasana once she is in Europe. Lasana adds Nafi will be the cook, making her a servant to the male passenger customers, which, according to Ken Harrow, restores the order, quote, of male bonhomie and homosociality, end quote. Later, after the storm and the demise of the second engine and Kaba, during which time there is no food or drink and the boat drifts away, two passengers struggle to throw Nafi overboard before Bai Lai intervenes again on her behalf. He and Moore pull her away from the men's grasp, and Abu tries to calm her down while the head of the Al-Pular explains, quote, these fools think she brings bad luck, end quote. Early on, when Lansana makes a pass at Nafi, she rebukes him while Kaba looks on smiling. This shows she can stand up for herself, even though others would have intervened if Lasana persisted. A more private venue, for example, a desert dune, in the case of desert travelers, may have provided negative results. Even though the most dangerous perpetrator in La Pirogue is nature, there still exists unequal and even threatening treatment toward the one female passenger. That Nafi is almost thrown overboard twice, that Lasana makes a pass at her, and that she had to disguise herself to board, prove the gendered treatment of the boat journey both on and before it. Based on the route, Nafi is a subject of less gender-based violence than female desert travelers, as seen, for example, in Mostafa Jajem's 2001 film Frontier, and the confinement of the boat allows less vulnerability in regards to passenger aggressions and more room for her agency. The absence of weapons and private space and Maghrebi men or smugglers represents lesser risk. While managing the gender structures that exist in sea migration, Nafi commands agency and power. Nafi defies Senegalese gender norms in boarding the boat, surviving until the end, and saving the other passengers. Her presence in the boat to participate in the masculine activity of migration is one way in which Nafi challenges gendered structures, demonstrating her agency and risk-taking early on in the film. Her disguise is a strategy of resistance as women migrants manipulate their bodies to serve them in their journey by underdressing and dressing up, according to Kastner. In occupying a space on the boat, Nafi's character challenges who is allowed to migrate and under what circumstances. This is verbally addressed in a conversation between Nafi and Lansana. Lansana tells her this journey is not for, quote, pretty women, end quote, but she rebukes, quote, toi et moi, c'est la même chose, end quote. You and I, it's the same thing. Touré's inclusion of a woman migrant questions who is allowed to migrate via boat and brings attention to women as financial providers. Aside from secretly boarding the boat, Nafi also breaks gender structures in her survival and in saving the remaining passengers from a fatal end. Nafi's successful journey may be thanks to men who kept her safe from other men, and the trip may be male organized, but successful arrival for all living is thanks to the one female passenger. By the end, most passengers have died by drowning, dehydration, sun exposure, or starvation. Nafi is among the few who remain. She aids in a successful arrival by spotting the helicopters, thus saving herself and the male passengers. Nafi stayed alert, heard the helicopter, and cried for help when all the men were physically too weak to do so, as showed in their failed attempts to yell. In conclusion, La Pirogue both illustrates and complicates gendered expectations and offers ways in which migrant women at sea can have agency. Nafi's character challenges characteristics perpetuated as masculine throughout the film. Even while relegated to stereotypically female roles on the boat, Nafi defies confinement to these roles by demonstrating her courage and strength. That Nafi is one of the few survivors makes a statement about the strength of women. By bookending the film with Nafi's survival and saving of the passengers, and the start of the film with the masculinized wrestling match of strength, Toure takes the gendered structures that exist in Senegalese culture and turns them on their head. Though he questions Senegalese emigration through outcomes of death and repatriation, Toure articulates that women are also fit to migrate and deserve equal treatment. That Nafi completes the journey when very few men could, and is the only one who is strong enough to call out to the helicopter so they can be saved, challenges the stereotype of women as weak, who could only survive with the protection of a man. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to, oh, Amanda, if you could stop sharing your screen, please. I'm going to hand it over to Professor McCracken, who will say a few remarks, and then we'll open it up to a general Q&A from the audience, but also please feel free to use the chat function to post questions or thoughts as Professor McCracken is speaking, and then we can kind of get to those. All right.
I will try to be brief. I thought this was a great panel. Thank you. And the papers come together in some really interesting ways, but not in a super coherent way, for me at least. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make overarching things. But one thing that was implicitly or explicitly at stake in all the papers was the question of agency and gendered agency. Rachel, I think your paper from the beginning introduced also a strong an important question about intersectionality. And one of the things that I would really like to hear more about is the extent to which concerns about white slavery are racializing citizenship and calling on a sort of racializing rhetoric of reform, right? That if you conform to the standards of domesticity, you attain whiteness. It seems to be in tension with this notion of white slavery. So I just like to learn more about that, particularly in the historical context that you are so ably gave us. And Judith, this is a little different, but in your discussion of the female stranger or the woman stranger, I take your point about the stereotypical behaviors assumed of her and attributed to her and even imposed on her. And I wondered about the work of stereotype in this narrative, because it of course does impose gender dominion or domination, but I wondered about in the extent to which in this story it also imposes a certain kind of dominion over the natural setting, the sort of island that I take it they have to master in order to survive. So I wondered about the way that gender was linked to a sense of place and a sense of interaction with non-human things and actors in the island setting. I think your paper and Amanda's went together in certain ways. And Amanda, but I'm going to say something about Tom's first, because I think that the question of the femina sacra is really smart. And I wondered if, there was so much going on in your paper. I really want to think with it more. But the question of naming and of agency, I thought in your discussion of that very rich analysis, I thought you were gesturing as well, or I thought you were saying as well, but I didn't hear you say explicitly that you're also talking about the subjectification of the femina sacra, which would be another way of destabilizing the object-subject difference, but with implications for the law, right? So I would I would be interested in hearing you think more about that, if that seems relevant to you. And also, I thought your paper spoke to Amanda's to the extent that the stowaway might also be seen as a feminist sacra, and what that might do for your reading of that position in the boat, and of the ways that the character in that position can speak back or can speak at all. And then finally, Amanda, also drawing on Tom's paper, I wondered about the camera. I felt that at times you were speaking very clearly about what happened in the story, or what happened on the boat, but I wanted a little bit more sense of what the camera of the documentary or of the filmmaker in this sort of pseudo documentary, what the camera's perspective was doing to that perception, or to that imposition of gender roles in the boat. And I don't know if that makes sense to any of you, but that but lots of questions came to me from your individual papers and from the ways they went together. So if anybody wants to speak to that, I think that's the next step, right, Julia? Or else maybe go to other people's questions if that doesn't.
Yeah, I think panelists feel free to respond, and we can also get questions in the chat if we need.
Yeah, I can go first. So thank you for that question. And that's really important. You know, like what is this term white slavery, and why is this something that reformers operationalized a lot in the progressive era activist movements? What's important to think about is that white slavery panic came about at the start of the 20th century. Previously, in the last few decades, the United States was undergoing the process of Reconstruction, right? Where we're sort of the process of Reconstruction was when slavery, you know, after the Civil War, was outlawed, and the United States economy had to be, you know, totally revolutionized as a result of the fact that it's not dependent upon slave labor anymore. So what's interesting about the term white slavery is that there's that caveat, white slavery. So it sort of implies that slavery can happen to white people too, and I think that's really interesting if we think about the United States relationship and tendency to ignore its own very problematic and racialized past. So in my view, I think what's interesting about this term is that it kind of sort of forefronts white girls, right? White European girls, and sort of dismisses, I guess, the more racialized past of slavery. If we're thinking about this in an American context. But I think if we think about this rhetorically too, the term white slavery is going to be really impactful for a 20th century American audience, right? You hear the term slavery, you hear the term white slavery, that really brings it home for richer, more American, white Americans. So I think, like, rhetorically, it's a really powerful term. Obviously, I think it dovetails with Americans' tendency to ignore their own relationship to slavery in the past, racialized slavery in the past. And the term didn't really become popularized until the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, which sort of arose out of this fear that with the influx of immigrants coming into the country, you have European girls, particularly from Eastern Europe, who are being prostituted out. And in my estimation too, I think that because there's a lack of empirical evidence that this was really happening, white slavery was more of a moral panic than anything else. But it's a really important question, because that term white slavery is so rhetorically powerful. If we think about how Americans during that time, you know, right after the Reconstruction, we're going into the Gilded Age, we're going into the Progressive Era, what is the relationship to the term slavery and the term white too? So why is it racialized? And I think you're spot on in saying, like, it does sort of question our ideas of citizenship, right? And again, I would say that the emphasis on the white sort of signals that we're moving past the racialized history of the United States in terms of slavery, and we're sort of going into a new era, even though, of course, that is you know, it's hard to escape that very problematic history, right?
Yeah, I would just add that I was trying to point to white as a racial identity, right? Of white, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just to respond to that, I think it's interesting too to think about the distinction between Northwestern Europeans and Eastern and Southern Europeans, because I think, like, at least in our modern conception, we tend to think of, you know, all Europeans as ethnically white, which I think would be true, but if it's also a nationalist identity as well. And I think that, like, you know, the activists like Bowen would have distinguished more between Northwestern Europeans and Southern Europeans. So yeah, I mean, white as a national, ethnic, and citizenship identity, I think is pliable, but you know, it all depends on who's speaking on this subject for sure. Thank you for your question.
Peggy, I think I'll just ask, just kind of like to follow up, or ask kind of like for a reiteration of your question for me. I know that you were talking about the camera's perspective, but if you could just kind of give me a little bit more to be able to think about it further.
I'm not sure I can. So to what extent is the camera or I shouldn't say to what extent because I haven't seen the film, but is the camera explicitly or self-consciously shaping our perception of what's going on in the boat, and particularly of the gender dynamics of what is happening in the boat?
Or yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, I think yes. I think with talking about the shot selection itself, I think I would have to go back and kind of look at it more at how the male characters are being portrayed with the camera, because I really, you know, focused in on Nafi herself, but then to compare it to, and I speak about gender and not just obviously women, I have to compare it to how the various male protagonists are being shot in the film, because I do think that the shot selection of her, you know, being to one side, her being to her by herself, happened really just to her, and that kind of gives us the idea of, you know, she's this separate, sometimes marginalized, sometimes threatened character. So I do think that the camera is making that happen. But to be fair, I would have to go back and say, okay, how are the male protagonists kind of being shot as well?
I think it would be interesting. I mean, for all the critiques that gaze theory has, you know, received, I think gaze theory might be interesting to think about here in terms of the way the protagonists are constructed as objects of desire, as objects of resistance.
Great, thank you.
So I just wanted to call to our attention that it is 11:18 and this panel is technically supposed to end at 11:15, but we can go a few more minutes. If people need to jump out or need a break before the keynote at 11:30, feel free, but if you guys want to keep chatting, we will be here, the Zoom will be on, and yeah. Sorry, just wanted to let people know that if they have to go, they can go, but if not.
I guess I'll jump in. I just wanted to say thank you, Professor McCracken, for your question. I think it's really important. I wanted to discuss a little bit more about the masculine space of the island and how it's traditionally that form, very much in the recreation of the masculine setting of the city as something that's constructed as that type of space where women's sort of existence becomes secondary in that regard. And I looked into a lot of research with Lauren Elkin that talks about the female flaneur and the idea of the masculine space of the city obviously being that women always did wander the city. So why is that experience neglected? So applying that sort of scope and how the masculine space of an island setting that is traditionally visited by sailors and sort of taken over through different explorers and taken claim over, I suppose, has always been done in a very masculine way. And then having January's character sort of navigate that and try to essentially get away from the gender roles that are imposed on her by the other men of the island setting, as she's the only woman that exists there. So she finds it very difficult to do anything that the men don't want her to do. So she's continuously watched and speculated, and as a result, she then has to observe them too, and everyone ends up in this sort of suspicious turmoil of paranoia with each other.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know the extent to which your island itself is feminized. I mean, as you know, the sort of conventional nature as feminine type thing. I mean, I don't know the text, so so it might be interesting to think about how the landscape or the world they live in is also feminized and is in need of being put in its place. I don't know if that's relevant or not to your text.
That is an interesting question. I guess I haven't considered too much how, in terms of like eco-criticism of maybe including something along those lines, because it steers slightly away from my focus. But it is interesting to think about how nature itself has some sort of claim over this, because I essentially argue that the men are reimposing their masculine presence on the island and putting these ideological impositions on a place that could be considerably neutral when it is an island. It shouldn't essentially be gendered, but it immediately is. And mainly because one of the characters, who's also named Robinson like the original text, takes claim and says the island will be called Robinson. So he automatically makes it a masculine space by just essentially laying down his name on it. So there isn't much room for January to navigate that. She's sort of continuously told that wherever she transgresses on the island, she fits some sort of feminine role. So even when she goes to bathe amongst the men, she says that she doesn't want to do it around them, and they immediately say, like, go to the wreckage and find yourself a bathing suit that you can use. We won't watch, or something like that. So immediately there's always this difference between January and the men of the island. They cannot accept her as a co-inhabitant of theirs.
But there too, it'd be interesting to think about ethnicity, right? To the extent that it's repeating Robinson Crusoe and the, you know, the.
Yeah, of course. I guess actually I took this presentation out of a much larger chapter that I've been working on, and I have included quite a lot of background on Robinson as a genre and how the canon is predominantly a male-dominated genre in itself, where you have all of these masculine tales of sailors going. And it's quite neglected to say that there isn't female Robinsons in the canon, because they exist, but they are generally informed by going there in masculine disguise or taking on characteristics that initially allow them to endeavor on that travel, and then it is later revealed that they're actually women. So it is interesting to, of course, then situate that in the literary canon.
All right, well, there aren't any questions from the audience, then I would say let's have a 5-minute break before the keynote. Thank you all so much for your great papers and great conversation afterwards. And we will see you in 5.
All right. Um, so it is now 11:30, and just as people are coming back in, I wanted to say a few remarks. First of all, in case you weren't able to come yesterday, my name is Dylan. I'm one of the co-organizers for this year's CLIF. And so, first of all, I did want to thank all of our presenters and faculty respondents. I think these diverse discussions over today and yesterday have really emphasized the importance and flexibility of migration as a conceptual lens for analyzing a really wide variety of fields and cultural objects. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Haji Bakara, who is an assistant professor in the English department here at the University of Michigan. His work addresses questions of human rights and refugee writing in the 20th and 21st century. And just recently, he edited a special issue for the Journal of Narrative Theory on the subject of refugee literatures. Today, he will be presenting a keynote address based on his current work on temporality and futurity in refugee writing. And I am sure that we are all looking forward to his remarks and the discussion to follow. So without further ado, then I would like to hand the reins over to Professor Bakara.
Thanks a lot, Dylan. Appreciate it, and thank you to everyone for inviting me as a sort of interloper in Comp Lit. It's really an honor and a pleasure. So I'll just be sort of synoptic in the beginning here. This is Time, Sovereignty, and Refugee Writing is the lead chapter of my second book called Refugee Futures, of which other parts are forthcoming in the Routledge Companion to Refugee Narratives and the Routledge Handbook to Politics and English and things. And it's more or less just a set of writing on temporality and refugees and refugee futurity. So this
Alexa,
piece
plain
is
WBUR.
Oh, sorry. Is that? Okay. I muted him. Okay. So this is a piece that is coming out of PMLA, and I just found it extremely difficult to adapt to a talk. I will just say that. I will be forthright about that. And so rather than try and cram everything in from the article, I wanted to speak really for a relatively short period of time, about 35 minutes. So just let it be known that there is a lot more behind this. I'm going to try and give a kind of synaptic overview of that article and leave time for discussion so that things that you want more sort of granularity about, you can get. Also, if you just want, if you want to know more right away, I can just send you the piece for PMLA. So just email me afterwards. Okay. Can I get screen sharing? Let's see, can I?
Yes. You should have it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So this is about 35 minutes. Okay, so my talk today is about three refugee writers from the last century: the German-born writer Hannah Arendt and Anna Segers, and the Kenyan-born British Somali poet Warsan Shire. I'm going to look specifically at Segers' 1944 novel Transit, at Arendt's early essays on Kafka from the 40s, and at Shire's poem Conversations About Home at the Deportation Center, which Rachel presented on yesterday, which alleviates me from sort of having to give some context around that poem. My focus is on a figure that these three writers variously attach to, and really which punctuates refugee writing over the last century. And this is really a figure, a refugee who just refuses to become a citizen. And there's numerous iterations of this in the corpus of refugee writing really since the mid-20th century. So my broad argument is that by willfully diverging from a pathway that would lead from refugee to citizenship, this figure who refuses to become a citizen overturns a dominant conception of time and of futurity, projecting the image of a single political subject, the citizen, and a single state form, the nation state. Put another way, though, what I want to argue is that Arendt, Sagers, and Shirey all advance the following proposition: the citizen is not the future of the refugee. Just to sort of let this proposition hang here, both in its concreteness and its abstraction, because it's really this proposition, its history, its implications, and its distinctions from contemporary political theory that my talk is about today. What I want to note, and which I'll go into deeper in my conclusion, is that this proposition, the citizen is not the future of the refugee, we cannot surmise from it the opposite, that the refugee is the future of the citizen, which is a proposition that is now circulating quite commonly in political theory, from Latour and Agamben to Claire Colebrook, right? So refugee writers do propose that the citizen is not the future of the refugee, but unlike contemporary theory, they do not flip this. They do not try to universalize the refugee, and that's very important. Okay. So why is this proposition important? The citizen is not the future of the refugee. So on the most basic level, it's important because it contests an assumption so deeply rooted in political modernity that it can go almost unremarked. This is the idea that futures are sovereign. As James Martell puts it, political modernity upholds a vision in which, quote, time itself appears to structure and deliver the necessity and inevitability of a particular kind of sovereignty, end quote. This concept, we can call it sovereign futurity, has been theorized by a long and illustrious list of thinkers, from Hobbes to Schmitt to Derrida. Political sovereignty, Wendy Brown can thus surmise, provides horizons and compass points, those necessary coordinates for moving forward in time, or even for imagining the time is moving at all, end quote. And yet, as I show today, refugee writers over the last century have repeatedly levied challenges to sovereign futurity by inventing, imagining, staging, theorizing a refugee's persistence as a historical actor who is non-sovereign. So students of Arendt will be familiar with the concept of non-sovereignty, on which I draw. In Arendt's political philosophy, the term refers to the contingency, relationality, and unknown outcome of human action in the world. To be non-sovereign is to be moving and acting within a continuum whose directions and conjunctions cannot be fixed, except as in the terms of national sovereignty, through violence or coercion. Whereas sovereign futurity is a form of temporality that casts humans as always moving towards an endpoint that is secure and sovereign, Arendtian non-sovereignty assumes that human action forgoes any given or preordained end. The concept of non-sovereignty as it's used in recent post-colonial scholarship also connects to refugee writing in its challenges to fixed temporalities, political geographies, and futures. So in post-colonial studies, for instance, Jaromir Bonia's idea of non-sovereign futures describes anti-colonial visions of 20th century global order that were not organized around traditionally bounded states. Non-sovereignty also invokes heterotemporalities that diverge from singular modernities of the European nation state and from Eurochronology. So the point I want to make is that non-sovereignty in both the Arendtian and the post-colonial senses structure the ideas and forms of refugee writing, but especially as this literature engages time. So on the one hand, the temporal persistence of refugees, staged again and again by refugee writers, this figure of a refugee who will not become a citizen, suspends the idea that citizenship, nation, and sovereignty are universal endpoints for the acting and moving human being. On the other hand, this persistence also pluralizes time, forcing us to acknowledge temporalities inhabited by peoples who are not and may never again be citizens of a sovereign nation state. Consequently, when writers like Arendt, Sagers, or Shirey imagine a refugee who persists into the future as a subject who is non-sovereign, they call into question a very deeply ingrained conception about how time bends to politics. We can think of this normative idea of time as citizen time. Citizen time is an often tacit but widely accepted idea that all human beings will become citizens of a sovereign nation through some combination of birth, self-determination, immigration, migration, repatriation, or assimilation. And as long as time is imagined in this way, then the citizen is always the future of the refugee. There are no exceptions. Citizen time is not a universal experience of time shared by all citizens, far from it. It is rather the construal of time as projected in the image of the nation imagined as universal. And while the premises of citizen time are clearly an illusion, they're an illusion with a powerful hold on the dynamics and preservation of global order. This is because citizen time ratifies the existence of some immutable future point where the refugee disappears into the prospective horizon of the citizen. The fantasy of this horizon is inextricably bound up with the belief that the lives of citizens will unfold towards a future that is secure and stable. As long as refugees disappear into the citizen, then citizens can go on with their own sense of sovereignty, security, and futurity intact. Yet when we read the work of refugee writers like Arendt, Sagers, or Surrey, we do not witness an acquiescence to the logic and arc of citizen time. To the contrary, we see various instances of a self-aware refusal to disappear into the citizen. What we might surmise is that these moments of self-conscious resistance to or digression from citizen time reflect a larger struggle to loosen control of time from the power of the nation-state form. It's in this sense that refugee writing, I hope to show, often represents time as plural and non-sovereign, revealing the multiplicity of temporalities and futures lost to the singular modernity of the nation. So my first case is Sagers' transit. Okay, so the backwards refugee, Sagers' orientations. Generally speaking, the quintessential popular refugee narrative is one of flight, from traumatic event in the past to safety and security in the future. Seen in this way, refugee writing follows an arc from non-sovereignty to sovereignty, or from wretchedness to righteousness, in Wim van Nguyen's terms. As one scholar notes, contemporary refugee writing tends to, quote, reproduce a linear narrative that moves towards self-possession and sovereignty, and which resolves an incorporation into the nation state and citizenship. Yet this has not always been so. So consider Anna Sagers' classic novel Transit, which should, by all appearances, be a forerunner of the contemporary flight narrative. The novel depicts a humanitarian crisis, Europeans fleeing Nazism through the French port of Marseille. Sagers and her family made that journey in 1941, sailing away from Europe on the same ship as André Breton, Simone Weil, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Victor Serge. Yet Transit does not reproduce the author's path precisely. Whereas Sagers sought and received asylum in the Americas, the narrative Transit chooses to remain in France and continue his life as a stateless person. The novel, therefore, is no autobiography or documentary text as it has often been read, but an outright counterfactual. Rather than documenting 20th century history as Sagers experienced it, the novel imagines a different shape of history and flow of time, one where refugees neither wallow in wretchedness or progress inevitably towards self-possession and sovereignty. So this is something that's distinct to Sagers and to Arendt, which is that as soon as they got asylum, they immediately became obsessed with a figure who refuses asylum, right? So I'm going to use stills from Petzolds' 2018 adaptation of Transit just to sort of get a visual fix on the novel. So the narrator of Transit is a nameless and stateless German who assumes a dead man's identity. He acquires the dead man's passport and a transit visa that will allow him to escape Europe. From the outset of the novel, though, the narrator's progress from statelessness to statehood, or refugee to citizen, is cast as a kind of dishonesty, a ruse. He's sort of stolen the possibility of becoming a citizen again. With the dead man's suitcase in hand, the narrator travels from Paris to Marseille, where he finds the port city filled with, quote, multitudes of poor devils, all longing to leave. His life then converges with this multitude poised for flight. And what he soon discovers, however, is that the lives of this stateless multitude remain entirely structured by the tempos and syncopations of the nation, the opening and closing of borders and the coming and going of ships. One of the novel's recurring scenes is of refugees rushing from one side of Marseille to the other in hopes of catching up with the bureaucratic tick-tock of nation states to which they supplicate for entry. Another is of endless quays of refugees assembled before an embassy's gates, where asylum seekers collapse and die before they can gain an audience with the diplomatic officials to whom they supplicate. In these scenes, where everything and everyone is actually figuratively and literally oriented towards national recognition, Sagers actually gives texture to the nation not as a territorially bounded entity, but as a dominant temporal field. And rather than enter into this field, the narrator of transit becomes a special witness to its distortions. For the most part, in the novel, he sits in a cafe, Flaneur-like, and sort of witnesses this happening, which is his fellow refugees rushing from consulate to consulate. Observing his fellow refugees from the seat in a cafe, the narrator diagnoses their plight as a subjection to what he calls consulate time, which, quote, is a kind of planetary time, in which you equate earthly days with millions of years, because worlds can burn in the time it takes the transit visa to expire. In this passage, the narrator and Sagers bear witness to the heterotemporality of lived experience being subsumed within the nation's sovereignty. For, quote, if consulate time can become planetary time, which is to say, if nationalism can become a cosmology, it's because any distinction between the nation and the world has been obliterated. For the refugees hoping to flee Marseille, there no longer appears to be a plurality of times and futures that humans can inhabit and live out, only the single unitary time to which every other human tempo must be synchronized in order to avoid death and oblivion. Yet the constriction of time that occurs in Sagers' novel is also the ground of its politics, a politics that is not unique to the novel, but I would argue an entire tradition of refugee writing. For when the unity of time is shown to be so forced and oppressive, then minor deviations, digressions, and shifts in orientation become especially apparent and significant. They can even become an act of resistance. In a world where the nation appears to command every route and horizon, as it does in transit, an unplanned change in direction can be a world-making proposition. And this is essentially what happens in the novel. As the narrator grows tired of a life that can lead in only one direction, he begins to trace wayward peregrinations and errant routes through Marseille. So a huge part of the later parts of the novel are more or less the narrator just wandering around the circuitous streets of the town, convincing himself that he doesn't actually want to leave Europe. Right? So the reader, kept close to the intimate first-person narrative, traces these patterns too. These digressive movements, which seem to travel in every direction but forward, disarticulate narrative time and the experience of reading the narrative from citizen time. These digressions recover the possibility of multiple temporalities that erupt in the interstices of national chronometry. As the novel progresses, the narrator slowly abandons his plan to leave Europe. His choice to stay prompts a fundamental reorientation of both the narrator and the reader, who learn to re-inhabit a temporality that will not converge with that of the nation state. One way to read the narrator's errant itineraries in transit are as Sagers' effort to bequeath to her past and future readers something like an archive of alternative orientations. Both literally and figuratively, the narrator's rangy peregrinations around Marseille make visible other horizons and futures that Sagers might have glimpsed or desired in her time as a refugee, futures that were foreclosed, narrowed to a single option, flight to an asylum to the Americas, and the quest for a new citizenship. The most enduring of these orientations is captured in an image that both begins and ends the novel and the film, which is the narrator sitting with his back to the door of a Marseille cafe and to the Atlantic Ocean. The sort of anti-teleological ambivalent orientation of the novel as a whole seems to be coded in this physical posture of the narrator, facing backwards. This is where we meet him and where we leave him, with his back turned, literally on the ships, sailing for North America as they cross toward a horizon where the refugee might disappear into prospective sovereignty. In fact, though, although he's procured a ticket for the ship and has acquired all the necessary documents, the narrator just no longer seeks passage on the ship. He's made the seemingly inexplicable decision to remain in Europe and to maintain the supposedly temporary position of a stateless person. Why does the narrator remain stateless or choose to remain stateless? Sagers is famously and strategically elusive on this point. His choice is neither heroic nor rational, nor even an outwardly principled decision, but rather a kind of cosmic digression from a refugee's expected progress from statelessness to citizenship. What then can we make of Sagers' decision to imagine a refugee who turns his back on the nation and the citizen? To imagine this just as the moment as she reaches safety, she writes this book where someone rejects that option. Right? She rewrites her own perspective, her own lived experience from this impossible choice of not going. And for an answer to that question, we can turn to Hannah Arendt. So that's my second case. So, like Sagers, Arendt fled through Marseille on her way to asylum in the United States in the 1940s. And also like Sagers, kind of miraculously, upon achieving asylum, Arendt immediately turns her attention to a refugee who chooses, almost cosmically, to remain a refugee. Unlike Sagers, however, Arendt did not simply depict the figure of the refugee who turns his back on future sovereignty. She theorized this figure as a challenge to the purported universality and immanence of the sovereign nation state and the national citizen. In her essays of the late 1940s, Arendt develops something approaching a political theory of time that comes out of her lived experience as a refugee. In a nutshell, this is what she concludes, and these are my words. Refugees who endure in time, even if only imaginatively, disentangle futurity from sovereignty. They pluralize time, revealing temporalities other than those lived out by the citizen, and bring to light political futures that break with the eschatology of political sovereignty. Importantly, the refugee who demurs from future sovereignty was a figure that Arendt discovered first in imaginative literature in Kafka's unfinished novel, The Castle, Der Schloss, only to later assume that position rhetorically in her autobiographical essay, We Refugees. So before Sagers' backwards-facing narrator, there's Kafka at the gates of the castle. During World War II, Arendt became the first critic to read K as a kind of proto-refugee. He, quote, desires only a home, a position, real work to do, and to become a member of the community. That's Arendt's reading of Kafka. At first, however, the castle officials reject his appeal to become a member of the community. Eventually, though, they grant him the privilege of belonging, but only out of pity. Their concessions to his demands are therefore an exception, a sovereign decree, right? As Arendt observes, the castle works by, quote, divine authority, granting rights only as their favors or as privileges. However, K, in some ways, like the narrator of Transit, is unwilling to, quote, regard his normal rights as privileges bestowed by the sovereign state of the castle. He rejects their offer, choosing instead to die alone in the village. Sovereignty is therefore not withheld from K. He's offered safety and community within the boundaries of the castle, but he refuses it on principle. In his rejection of the castle's conditional sovereignty, K prefigures the posture of refusal that I've identified in Transit. However, neither Sagers nor Kafka offer much in the way of explanation for their characters' acts of refusal. Arendt, however, attributes immense theoretical significance to K's actions. She interprets his refusal of the castle's terms of belonging as evidence that Kafka foresaw a more egalitarian future to come. Through K's actions, Arendt argues, Kafka signaled to his readers that a future world was possible, one where one's rights belong as an equal member of community would not issue, quote, from mysterious forces emanating from above or below, which Arendt is obviously talking about, either popular or divine sovereignty. By this account, K refuses to join the castle as a political exception because he anticipates a future where membership in a community will neither require nor permit exceptions. Put another way, K rejects the conditions of present sovereignty because he envisions a non-sovereign future. So as Arendt came to see it, K's principled refusal of the castle's sovereignty made palpable an entire historical trajectory, a future that, quote, human beings would construct in which the actions of man depend on nothing but himself and his spontaneity, and in which human society is governed by laws prescribed by man himself, rather than by mysterious forces, rather than by sovereignty. Kafka's art is the expression of some future world, Arendt wrote in 1944, quote, which is our future too, if we are to have any future at all. Arendt found in Kafka and K what Reinhard Gesellick calls future past, an archive of expectations waiting to be blasted out of the continuum of history. So to summarize then, Arendt and Sagers, who were writing as stateless refugees in the 1940s, both more or less simultaneously seize on this figure of a refugee who rejects the terms of belonging imposed by sovereign power and chooses to endure as a kind of principled protest against the powers that be. So this is a connection within the mid-century. But we need to remember that they wrote from a very specific historical interregnum, a brief moment before the political contours of the post-war world were determined. In part, at least, the perspective of writing from this wartime interregnum fostered Sagers and Arendt's abilities and their inclination to imagine political futures outside of and beyond the primacy of sovereign states. In other words, Arendt and Sagers could and did imagine that World War II was being fought for something other than their recrudescent nationalism. Right? So there's a historically specific context for this idea of waiting for something better. Today's refugees write from a different interregnum, not a moment before the global consolidation of sovereign nation state, but rather a period when ecological, political, and economic forces are radically calling into question the integrity of national sovereignty and the stability of the future. If mid-century refugees eventually found themselves excluded from a universal history predicated on sovereign futures, today's refugees are shaping what Chakrabarty sees as, quote, a new universal history of humans, where the Anthropocene and climate change poses for us a question of a human collectivity, an us. As Claire Colebrook argues, it is now increasingly common, quote, increasingly common to imagine all humanity as being in the condition of seeking refuge because of an increasingly volatile planet. These scholars, scholars like Claire Colebrook represent what might be called the new refugee universalists. The new universality, according to Bruno Latour, consists in feeling that the ground is in the process of giving way, as we learn that we are all in migration towards territories yet to be discovered and occupied. So whereas mid-century refugees like Arendt and Sagers use their writing to disentangle human futures from national futures, today the future of humanity as a whole is increasingly figured through the refugee. So this emergent critical inclination towards universalizing the refugee gives a new inflection to the tradition of refugee writing that I've been tracing, which is committed to representing the refugee's endurance in time and into the future. But to writers like Arendt and Sagers, who clearly wanted to problematize the idea that the citizen is always the future of the refugee, do they now appear as prophets who foretold a world to come where refugees, rather than citizens, command the image of the future? I really don't think so. So these are my words. So reading refugee writing against contemporary theory, we find one vital difference. Rather than universalizing the refugee, writers de-universalize the citizen. This is a really important distinction, and I just want to clarify a bit. So a theorist like Colebrook or Latour argues that within the scale of deep time, human beings are all inevitably going to be rendered a migratory species, forever seeking refuge from climatic instabilities. And they're probably right if we think in a certain scale. They thus ask us, in Colebrook's words, to imagine migration not as the unfortunate exception in otherwise stable world of nations, but to ask the question, quote, what if there were no nation? So there's certainly common ground here with refugee writers who have long contested the idea that refugees are an exceptional phenomenon in an otherwise stable world. Yet the question that refugee writers ask is not conditional, not predicated on the what if of deep time. Instead, when they stage a refugee's persistence in time, they do so in order to show that not all refugees become citizens. It's not that all human beings will one day be refugees. It's that not all refugees will one day be citizens. And we need to take this fact very seriously. Refugee writers ask us to rethink political temporality based on this more proximate and modest fact of the citizen's false universality, not in some future universality of the refugee. Those are my words. So in my final reading, I want to elaborate on this distinction between the way that theorists universalize the refugee and the way that refugee writers de-universalize the citizen, because frankly, I find the wisdom of refugee writers just to be much more constructive and useful for understanding the present. And it's precisely a principled rejection of the citizen's universality in the present that Shiri advances in her poem, Conversations About Home at the Deportation Center. Shiri's poem opens up a conversation about what kinds of political community can be imagined when futurity is disentangled from any single political subject, but not when the future is subsumed within another singular horizon in the way that I find Latour or Claire Colebrook or Agamben to advance. So thankfully, because of Rachel's paper yesterday, most of us are now aware of this enormous extra literary phenomenon that is Shiri's poem, which is more or less solely based on the circulation of this one line, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." But while Shiri's poem has mostly been read as a testimonial that is trying to change people's minds about the need to accept asylum seekers, it's actually a much more confrontational and intellectually rich text than its popular readings would suggest. It's not just a strident call for the recognition of the plight of refugees, it's an invitation to listen to and learn from the concrete historical perspective of those for whom stability and sovereignty are definitively a thing of the past. To have solidarity with the speaker of the poem, you need to recognize much more than the fact that their home is the mouth of a shark. So at the halfway mark of Conversations, the speaker pauses to reflect on her situation as a refugee, as generative of distinct knowledge about the world. I know a few things to be true. I do not know where I'm going. Where I come from is disappearing, and I am unwelcome. My beauty is not beauty here. Here, Shiri marks out her position in time, in history, or the speaker does, as an interregnum that lies between what Arendt had called a past that is no longer and a future that is not yet. The significance of this pause that lies at the center of Conversations, I do not know where I'm going, where I've come from is disappearing, needs to be understood in terms of the multiplicity of Shiri's poetic eye, which incorporates words and phrases taken often verbatim from contemporary refugees that she interviews. So this eye that is stalled between past and future contains multitudes. In fact, it contains a very specific multitude. Millions of refugees and migrants who can move neither backward nor forward along a pathway to citizenship, but who nevertheless live on. It's members of this multitude that Shiri met as squatters in the abandoned Somali embassy in Rome in 2013, a group of young Somalis, Eritrean, Congolese, and Sudanese refugees. These young people, constantly exiled from the cultures and all of the countries that you think you belong to, it's a quote from Shiri, inspired her to write Conversations. So these refugees construct lives and communities in the interstices of national life. They open up and inhabit trajectories and temporalities that will never align with the normative ideals of citizen time. And by channeling these voices, Shiri develops a collective eye that no longer seems to beg entry into the nation. In the poem, the refugee's urgent message to the citizen is not a sentimental appeal, but the communication of a distinct knowledge about the uncertainty of the future for refugees and citizens alike. The full breadth of Shiri's message comes in the final stanza of Conversations, in which she adopts a second person address. The I that hovers between a disappearing past and a non-sovereign future addresses a you, the reader, the citizen, interpolating them into this interregnum. The stanza shifts from a third to a second person address and begins with a heckler assailing the speaker. I hear them say, go home. I hear them say, fucking immigrants, fucking refugees. Are they really this ignorant? Do they not know that stability is like a lover with a sweet mouth upon your body, 1 second, and the next you are a tremor lying on the floor covered in rubble and old currency, waiting for its return? All I can say is I was once like you, the apathy, the pity, the ungrateful placement. And now my home is the mouth of a shark. Now my home is the barrel of a gun. I'll see you on the other side. So this is the end of the poem. At first glance, this attack seems to invite us, the reader, to distinguish ourselves from the hecklers and affirm our solidarity with the refugee speaker. We think that we have learned from the poem, and therefore we think we know what the hecklers do not know, that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. We also know, therefore, that the refugee cannot go home. When the pronoun shifts in the last two sentences from they to you, all I can say as I was once like you, however, she yokes the reader to the hecklers as subjects who presumably share an uncritical acceptance of our own stability. Thus we, progressive readers, academic humanists, imagined allies of the displaced, are just as ignorant as the hecklers. Yet what exactly are we ignorant of? What does Shiri want us to know? One answer lies in the distinct political tense of conversation. When the speaker remarks, quote, I was once like you, she reminds us that she too was once a citizen, uncritically accepting of her stability and placement in the world. In this active address, however, she calmly positions the citizen reader within her own past. Yet she does not intimate that she will be a citizen again in the future. And if the reader can recognize that they are the past of the refugee, then the stability and sovereignty experienced by citizens, not only in their present, but in their very vision of the future, must also cease to exist in perpetuity. What Shiri's speaker, quote, knows to be true, in other words, is that the conditions of life on our planet and the scale of human displacement now underway means that the promise of a secure and nation-based future for all, the promise of the post-war order, is a thing of the past. For the speaker of conversations and the multitude she invokes, there is no return to the sovereignty of citizenship and the nation state. If we want to share in solidarity with her, then there's only a difficult path forward, not in recognition that we will all be refugees one day in deep time, but that not all people will become citizens in the way once projected as universal. The speaker's parting message, I'll see you on the other side, is not a prognostication about an inevitable or catastrophic future where we are all refugees. Rather, it's an invitation to permanently leave behind our sense of the permanence of security and sovereignty in the world, one that has rested for a century on the belief that we, citizens, are the refugees' future. In her poetics, Shiri does not celebrate some radically open space beyond the state. Instead, she experiments imaginatively with the bare fact of the speaker's ongoingness as a refugee and as a non-sovereign subject, in order to invite us, the reader, to unthink the conflation of national citizenship and sovereignty with futurity itself. The world historical question posed by Shiri at the end of Conversations is this: if we can imagine ourselves as a refugee's past, then what kinds of futures are possible? Thank you.
Right. And thank you very much, Professor Bakara, for those really insightful and I think very thoughtful remarks. And I am sure that there are plenty of questions from the audience. So like with the previous panels earlier, feel free to use either the chat or the raising hand feature to indicate that you have a question that you would like to raise. Okay, I think we have a question from Yopi.
Okay. I'm happy to wait my place in the queue, but I guess I wanted to just say, first of all, Haji, that was a great talk. Thank you for, and actually ties in so well with some of the other presentations we've been hearing. I actually just have a question about how you're reading the final lines of the poem in terms of the problem of address. You know, I mean, sure, a speaker is not stable. The you is weirdly abstract. The I, you know, it seems like if it's an invitation to leave behind a sense of security in terms of the citizen reader, also is like, oh, sorry. It's also radically destabilizing what are the conventions of poetic reading and what we are supposed to do with this as an understanding of this as a poem. So I was wondering if you could speak to that as well.
Well, I think I would hope that all of those other destabilizing features of her poetics, and particularly of her shifting mode of address, would buttress my argument that it's not reinstating a sort of staid teleological binary where a refugee says, recognize my pain and suffering, and so that I can be like you, and that in fact it's asking us to think about a future beyond the binary of refugee and citizen, I think, and therefore the fact that its mode of address seems somehow alien to us, I think partially, or I think in great part, complements the fact that a destabilizing poetics would also be presaging a destabilizing and necessary rearrangement of political subjectivity and in an uncertain world. But I really like this idea of it's Gary Wilder's idea from Freedom Time, this term that he uses, which is political tense, and he uses it. It's a term that he's drawing from Césaire and Senghor's poetics, right? And it's this idea that, particularly in a kind of second person address, the power of orienting two political subjects in a way that is unexpected, right? So the refugee addressing the citizen as the past, and anti-colonial thinkers like Césaire and Senghor addressing French citizens as brothers, even in a moment of anti-colonial tension. This is sort of where I'm getting this idea of political tense from, which is that there's a power in the minor orienting work of poetics when the people who are being addressed have relatively encrusted, sedimented political subjectivities that need to be broken apart, right? And so this is I find when address and orientation become especially important. And it's really also just really important that it is a conversation between a citizen and a refugee, right? I mean, it is a stage of conversation, and that phenomenological specificity of the poem means that it will make its meaning through the relative space and place and time of the speaker and the reader, right?
All right, and then I think we have another question from Johannes.
Thanks. I'm also happy to wait my turn. I can't see if there's grad students in the queue too, because I'm assuming this shouldn't just become a faculty conversation. So I'm happy to wait also.
Okay, I don't currently see anybody else in the queue. So okay. Feel free to go ahead.
All right, so then I'll add my thanks to Haji for your talk, and in particular, I mean, I like your work a lot, and I'm very appreciative of the careful analytical lens that you use to come to really far-reaching conclusions, including the one about differentiating between the universalization of the migrant and the de-universalization of the citizen. I think that's incredibly productive. I have two questions that hopefully are related. So on the question of the universalization of the migrant that you want to resist with the help of refugee writers, I'm curious where you put Arendt, if she's as secure in the camp of the de-universalization, particularly in her, because there's a tendency to read modernist literature as a literature of homelessness. And I think that is in part how she reads Kafka. So my question to put a fine point on is, doesn't she universalize the migrant in her reading of Kafka to some extent? My other question is, ties in with Yopi's and has to do with endings, which I think become particularly important when you're talking about futurity. Then the end kind of bears particular weight of a narrative or a poem. So I'm curious about Zegers. If I remember correctly, and it's been a while, but if I remember correctly, there's two aspects to the ending that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. One is the final boat that the protagonist turns his back on, which is kind of, you described as the eternal futurity of citizenship and sovereignty. Doesn't that get torpedoed in the Atlantic? And what does that mean?
I think so.
In other words, is there something instrumentalizing about him? That's one question. And then doesn't he end up, or isn't there a future perspective of him going to farm peaches in the countryside in southern France? And what kind of a futurity is that, if not a nostalgic or reintegrative vision? I'm just curious how you read it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Both of those things are gestured towards at the end of Transit, right? So maybe that is we meet him as second person. We sit down, we begin to talk with him, and he talks about a boat that just got torpedoed. And it's not, I don't think it's confirmed that is the boat that he was going to be on, right? But it is absolutely suggested. And it's also suggested, that he is, because he's a worker and a socialist, that he's going to return to a way of life that is fundamentally internationalist, what I would think of, that is pre-national, paranational, right? They don't care what kind of passport he has. He's gonna go back to just labor, and more than me. I mean, these are actual Sager's actual affiliations are with international labor, right? And so absolutely. There's also the possibility that what she's her hope, and this suggests too that she feels like the war is hopefully not going to, lead to capitalist nation states and recrudescent nationalism, that it's going to lead to an intensification of labor internationalism and a kind of fluidity and solidarity based on that, which would trump blood, that labor would trump blood, right? So I think that's absolutely the case, but all of that is still left very ambiguous at the end of the novel. It really, all we know is that he's eating pizza and drinking rosé with his back turned to the ships, and he's not going to go, right? He's going to do something else. And it just remains one of these very, very significant literary historical facts that Sagers and Arendt get off the boat and immediately start thinking about what would have happened if they didn't get off the boat, or what were the possibilities, were there any other possibilities? And for sure, the meandering of Transit must in some way reflect Sagers, who was waiting for months and months and months. Sometimes her husband wasn't there because he was Jewish and he was in hiding, wandering the streets with nothing else to do, thinking about, is there any other route than just flight, supplication, this sort of unidirectional flow of people. So she must have saw the horizon. She must have sat up on a hill in Marseille and looked back, looked one direction, looked the other direction, and wondered if she could go either, right? But she was being pulled by history in this one direction, and so she wants to think of other ones. So with Arendt and universalizing Kafka, that's a good point. I'll have to think about it in terms of Kafka, but in the article which I sent to you, I think the vanguard is not a universalizing concept. The vanguard is precisely, what it would have meant to her. The refugees, the vanguard, they're a minority, distinctly a minority that nonetheless shape the future, right? And so I think we have to take seriously that she understood what the vanguard meant. And it's not that the vanguard is not going to populate the future. The vanguard is going to be the ones that pierce through, into the new and allow us to see, new configurations, radically reconfigure social relations. Obviously, it's ironic, deeply ironic that she's using the term vanguard because of the lowly status of the refugee. But so I really think that her anti-universalizing theory is contained in what she would have thought the valence of vanguard was, right?
All right, and then we have a question from Mari.
Hi, thank you so very much for the wonderful talk. Pardon me, it's a bit of a general question, but your presentation gave me words for this general question that I wanted to ask, right? So pardon me if it's too general, but like, how does the approach of like channeling the refugee voice, right, as a challenge to citizen time, how do we orient that critique, which I think is really powerful, towards like the need to disambiguate between the like discursive portrayal of the refugee as the threat to citizen time, right, to the peace that the citizen is offered by the nation state. So that's the question. It's a little general, but yeah, your wonderful presentation gave me words for it, right? Like, I think it's a theme we saw in the presentations too, how that portrayal, how complex it can get, right, across racial paradigms and different geographies. So that's the question. Sorry if it's too.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's a very specific way I can answer it, and hopefully it maps onto what you're thinking. And so I actually this paper, when it was first submitted to PMLA, was called Refugee Futures, and the book of which I want it to be a part is called Refugee Futures. And that I came to it because I began, a couple of years ago, I started to take notice and be worried about this repeated conflation of refugees with the catastrophic future, right? In basically cli-fi, sci-fi, and social theory. Every form of speculative thinking that we can think of projects refugees into the future as more or less the denizens, along with like zombies and mutants, of the bad future, right? The future that needs to be intervened at any cost, right? And this is, in some ways, an old story too, right? 1984 begins with Winston Smith watching refugees being bombed in the Mediterranean, being bombed by a helicopter in the Mediterranean, right? So there's been this long sort of projection of refugees into a sort of dystopian future, right? And so this signals this enormous anxiety that we have, that is both the conflation of the end of the nation state with the end of the world, right? When we think of refugees as apocalypse, we're really kind of thinking about the end of sovereignty as the end of civilization and things like that. And that anxiety, we really need to think deeply about what that anxiety is and what the flip side of that is, right? And so what I became interested in was that this projection of refugees into the bad future in contemporary narratives, which are not written by refugees, right? This is the thing. This is why I don't write about these dystopian futures, because these are not refugee narratives. These are narratives that are written by refugees. They tell us something about the pressures that are on refugee narrativity to court, which is to say that we might think of refugees as a people who have for a very long time faced these huge impositions on their own futurity, have always caused anxieties, both in how they inhabit time as well as in how they inhabit space. And so there are people who have been barred from having a legitimate political future, yet nonetheless who are constantly trying to figure out ways, create different forms to represent their own status as historical and political actors. Right. So I think that the anxieties that we have about refugees sort of dissolving society are there. They're there in the history of refugee writing, and what the political grounds of refugee writing has often been them trying to narrate their futurity in a way that makes us confront the falseness anxieties about what they produce. I mean, one person who is really good on this and is kind of is Vu Tran, who's a Vietnamese American writer, right? And he has this idea of refugee noir, which is a cool idea. It's just in a talk that he gave. He hasn't written about it. But basically, he's like, refugee narratives and immigrant narratives and noir are really all the same because they're all about these sort of epistemic absences that freak people out. They're like about a kind of way of a sort of what we can't know, right? The necessity of integrating what we can't know into narrative. This is what connects them. And I think that's, I mean, it's similar. Anxieties about refugee apocalypse or refugee futures or bad futures are really about our anxieties about not being able to control through, securitization, techno-cultural, terraforming the future that we will inhabit, right? So, I mean, I guess I hope that kind of touches on it, right? Which is to say that refugees always have known that they cause this anxiety, and that has been both the pressure on their narrative as well as the epistemological power of their writing, I think.
Okay. I think we might have time for maybe one or two other questions if anyone, especially graduate students, have anything that they would like to ask. Marina.
Yes, thank you. I just have a quick question. I don't know if this really ties into your research in any way, but there's been some work about diasporic temporality and diasporic networks and forms of belonging as also a form of something that contrasts or an opposition to national identities and national temporalities, redemption to temporalities. So I wonder if that, especially Arendt and Arendt's work on German Jewish writers, and she also conducted these dialogues with other members of the German Jewish diaspora. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and especially how that might bear on your reading of these texts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really, I guess my route into that is yes, diasporas and immigration and the Black Atlantic and all also create sort of heterotemporalities that don't fit into national histories, and they're cutting across in many different ways. The particular the specificity of refugee temporalities is that they are that a huge amount of our idea of order in the world, whether we like it or not, depends on this idea that refugees will always become citizens, right? And so diasporic temporalities of movement and settlement and affiliation aren't wrapped up in this kind of trying to think, I mean, sort of ordering principle where we don't rely on diasporic peoples to settle in a certain way, in the way that we rely epistemologically on refugees to move into the future of citizenship or something like that. But the person who does this really well is Wilder in Freedom Time, who really just kind of reads sort of post-war anti-colonial federalism, right? So ideas about democratizing empire, which are obviously extremely important to diasporic communities who often historically have emerged from empires and then had to fit into nation states, right? I mean, emerged from multi-ethnic empires and then had to fit into nation states. So thinking about the French imperial nation state and the Habsburgs. I mean, when Arendt's thinking about diasporic community is, I think, always, comes out of her understanding of multi-ethnic empires in the same way that, for example, negritude writers also thought about the possibilities of diasporic communities not aligning with nations as coming out of multi-ethnic empires, right? So I do, and the English Empire as well, right? So I think the great writers on diasporic, this is to say, the great writers on diasporic heterotemporality have almost always been talking about the transition from multi-ethnic empires into nation states, right? Multi-ethnic empires generally could manage multi-temporalities in a way that nation states couldn't. The flip side was that nation states have equality as their basis, and multi-ethnic empires didn't have equality as their basis, right? So.
All right. And are there any last questions for Professor Bakara?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, if you're interested, just email me and I'll send you the PMLA draft that is more or less done. So, and really, and thank you so much. Honestly, anyone who is working on this stuff, Rachel and Matt, who are my grad students, will confirm that I'm very, very enthusiastically into talking to anybody and everybody about them. So please just do get in touch.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I guess now it's time for us to kind of close out the conference. I guess originally I think in our schedule, me and Dylan said we would do it together, but I can just read it out, or Dylan.
However you
let me know.
If you want to go for it, go for it.
Okay, well, again, thank you so much, Professor Bakara, for that incredible keynote and the lively discussion afterwards. Dylan and I wanted to say a few quick words that we wrote together before we log off the Zoom. It's been really great to hear from all of our panelists and their great papers, all of our faculty respondents, and all of the participants who came to watch today and yesterday. We really enjoyed sharing this weekend with you. And we'd also like to thank the Department of Comparative Literature for their continued support of CLIF through all of the upheavals and uncertainties brought on by the pandemic. This has been postponed a year, but here we are. And then we also wanted to thank our cohort once again. It's been really, really great to organize this conference with all of you, but we also wanted to especially thank Marina Mayorski, because she put in a tremendous amount of work to get the virtual version up and running, and we truly could not have done this, Marina. So thank you so much, Marina, and we look forward to next year's CLIF, hopefully in person. Everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.